Hello, sorry for not being here last weekend. I had a holiday. I went to visit my friends in Coventry, and Coventry is actually an interesting one in terms of its music. It has a lot of rhythm and blues influences. A lot of the UK reggae scene came from Coventry, and of course it was very important to rave culture. I went to a really good exhibition actually in Coventry in an old IKEA, which is about the rave scene there in the early 90s. So it was really cool, it was really interesting, and I enjoyed seeing my friends. But today we are going to be talking about Herbie Hancock's Headhunters. Now, Herbie Hancock is a keyboardist who became famous for playing as part of Miles Davis's quintet. However, he went off to do his own things, and he released a lot of fantastic albums in his own right. In fact, the album we're going to talk about today is so important to music, it is in the US Library of Congress. So that's just to give you an idea of how important this album is. So Herbie Hancock at the start of the 70s was in an interesting place. He'd come from the hard bop jazz scene with Miles Davis, a very sort of purist jazz scene, but he was becoming increasingly more interested in rock and funk as musical genres. In fact, he listened to Sly and the Family Stone's "Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself," and he said, quote, "I feel afraid. These guys can do this music, and I'm not sure even I could do this music as this proficient, amazing jazz keyboardist." He also recognised that at that time a lot of his audience was white, which wasn't a problem, but he wanted to make a record that appealed to his black roots, that made people within his community dance and enjoy themselves and so on. He'd also come off quite an experimental phase with one of his acts called Marandishi, and although he said that he really enjoyed this period and got a lot from it, he found the music to be at points quite heavy. And even though he connected with his musicians on stage most of the time, there were points where he felt like he needed to go back to something that's a bit more grounded. So this is laying the foundations for Headhunters. Now, jazz fusion is an interesting one because to this day there's still a lot of debate within jazz circles about fusion, and there's a lot of gatekeeping, especially from jazz purists, towards mixing jazz with anything else. For example, there was a critic at the time that fairly dismissively looked at efforts from artists such as Miles Davis with his albums Bitches Brew, and dismissed it because it was going off towards rock. He said that rock people became bored and experimented in jazz, and jazz people were becoming bored and experimenting in rock, but also trying to appeal to a broader audience, selling themselves out, if you will. But Herbie Hancock, as I said, really made this record to appeal to the funk black communities that he came from, that he shared some kinship with. He wasn't particularly interested in making an album that was more accessible for a wider audience. In some ways, he'd already done that. Now, Headhunters is famous for its jazz fusion, as I said, and it's interesting looking back on it now, especially in the UK jazz scene, when you've got people like Nubian Twist and Sons of Kemet and The Comet Is Coming and so on, that are totally unashamed of using jazz within the context of electronic music, and it almost being jazz electronic music, really. But back then, this was kind of unheard of. But Herbie Hancock makes a statement right from the get-go with the first song, Chameleon, probably the most famous song off the record, with that bass line that he plays on an ARP Odyssey synthesizer. Bam, 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 bam. And instantly, you know what's going to come from this record. It is so groovy, so danceable, so funky that it is just irresistible to... You just want to move your head. It's just brilliant. It's fantastic. And then that back kick, that back beat comes in on the drums, and instantly you know that this is a funk record with jazz influences, but a funk record fundamentally. It's something that could be played at a soul and jazz night and funk night to this day, and it wouldn't feel out of place. You know, it's brilliant. And that backbeat comes in. Now, Chameleon uses something that musicians call the pocket, which is where... So Herbie's riffing on his right hand with the piano and playing these amazing chords and so on. He's playing that bass line with his S on. He does this for like 7.5 minutes. It's mad. And he's slightly behind the beats, but it's just enough where it's not out of time, but more groovy. And this is something that the best musicians can do really well. They're just slightly out of sync with the drums, but it just gives it this funk, this human touch that's brilliant. It's something that I think a lot of modern music can take some lessons from, actually. You know, we use digital audio workstations and so on, and we program everything to the nth degree to be exactly grid-lined and on beats, and there's nothing wrong with that. But with albums such as Headhunters, which is still, you know, the fact that it was using a synth bass rather than a double bass by itself was quite a change from the hard bop scene that Herbie had come from. You know, it's quite a statement. It was very forward looking, but it would still have that human touch to it that just makes the music come alive, in my opinion. So Chameleon starts off with this bum 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 bum, and the drums come in, and then you got this like wah influenced guitar, and it starts and it's slow, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And this is the thing as well with this song, is the band is so tight, they're so locked in. These are a group of musicians, Harvey Mason on drums. These are a group of musicians that Herbie actually mostly hadn't played with before, but they were absolutely at the top of their game, and they were so locked into this jam that actually the song gets faster and faster and faster as it goes on. The bass line stays the same, it builds up, but it still stays the same fundamentally. But the solos that Herbie's playing, and the amount of synthesizers he has as well, like he's playing with one and then he changes the settings and he does another riff, and it sounds like 10 musicians playing at once, but it's actually 4, just absolutely, well, maybe 3 on Chameleon actually, that are just completely zoned in together. So Chameleon builds for 8 minutes. You get this sort of cathartic stab, and then it goes into the second part of the song, and this shows more of the jazz influence, I think, that Herbie had before coming into the record. You know, it goes into this sort of 3-time on the drums, and he puts in these strings, these padded strings, and the sound just broadens out so much more. But again, even though it's freer, this section, it's more loose, the band is still so locked in with each other, and again, that bit builds, and then all of a sudden you get the famous stab once again, and you go back into the A section, and the album the song just slowly fades out on the original riff. And it's 15 minutes. It's a long song, but it feels like 3. It's brilliant. It's just so groovy and fun. And the thing is that Chameleon is now a staple of jazz. It's a jazz standard now, which is interesting considering, you know, how much it sort of broke out of the conventions and norms of the time. But I think it's just so undeniable as a song. And fundamentally, I think this is what makes jazz standards so great. Fundamentally, it's really basic. And so any musician can put their interpretation on top of it. You know, it's just a huge jam, essentially. But Herbie Hancock's band is so tight that it doesn't feel like they're improvising. It feels just interlocked. So then we go into the second song, which is Watermelon Man, which again is quite a statement from Herbie Hancock, because Watermelon Man really is a jazz standard. It was part of Miles Davis's quintet 10 years before, and the original tune is very much like as purist jazz as you can get, but Herbie Hancock you know, recontextualizes this in a funk context, and you can really see why so many hip-hop artists have sampled this album that are being played. They're just a hip-hop groove, like 10 years before hip-hop was even really a thing. Just this fantastic mid-tempo beat. Now, what makes Watermelon Man really interesting, in my opinion, is the fact that Herbie Hancock had explored pygmy music quite a lot in his previous acts, and just through his musical knowledge and vocabulary. So Watermelon Man uses this pygmy wood instrument. It's blown into, and it gives the song just this distinctive sound. It sounds like a perfect blend between sort of African tribal music and funk music, and then the bass comes in. It's a brilliant bass line. Then the album moves on to a song called Sly, which is named after Sly and the Family Stone. The song opens up on, I guess, a fairly Sly and the Family Stone-ish sounding groove, but it probably is the most experimental of the album. It explores the most ideas, but it, after the first 2 minutes where it has this kind of cool groove, it stops, and then it comes in with this really fast section where the band are just like, this is probably the most virtuosic playing of the entire album. The band are just completely locked in with each other, but they're playing this really fast beats. It's like interestingly, it's kind of like a Fela Kuti style section. It's just so fast, but also very funky and jazzy, and they're all playing their instruments really, really intensely. There's a line that Herbie Hancock plays about 8 minutes in, where he's just building up chords, stacking chords on his keyboard, and the band, and it's almost out of key, but the band just responds so well to it, and then it's so much dissonance, it builds and builds, and then bam, back in with the groove. You can really see why modern musicians like Jacob Collier take so much influence from Herbie Hancock. because his approach to music and his instruments is so revolutionary. It's so out of the box. It's brilliant. And yeah, Sly it's not as, it probably isn't a song that could be played in the clubs, maybe, I don't know, maybe a weird club, but it's still, I listened to it last night, and once you get in the headspace for it, it's still such a bop. It's brilliant. So the album closes on a song called Vein Melter, which is the only down-tempo tune on the album. Vein Melter was named after Herbie Hancock's friend who died from a heroin overdose. And if there's anything that sort of gives the album a bit more depth than face value, it's probably this song, actually, because we've had 3 very intense, very loud party, I guess, songs, if you will. And then this song is a lot more reflective. It's a lot more calm. But it fits so well into the whole record. You know, it needs some breathing space. You need some time off, if you will. And this song provides it. That's not to say that it's boring. It's totally not boring. And in fact, it features some brilliant saxophone playing from one of the few members of Herbie Hancock's bands before he started the Headhunters. And yeah, it's just this really slow, slightly melancholic, but still quite uplifting tune. The whole album in general, even though I know there's that sort of sad context to Vein Melter, but the whole album in general is just so uplifting. It's so fun. It's such a pleasure to listen to. You can't help but not love it. I think, anyway. Now, the thing is about Headhunters is it's a very accessible album, I think, relatively speaking. You know, I've met people in my life, people that are into music are saying, I like music, but I don't like jazz. And that's fine. You know, people are into their own things. And I'm sure there's people that are really into music as a whole. Well, sorry, not as a whole, mostly into music, but do take an exception to any kind of jazz. It's just not their thing. If they like lyrics or so on, like, yeah, jazz is not really necessarily going to provide in that regard. But what I will say is, if you like Stevie Wonder, Sly and the Family Stone, Parliament and Funkadelic and so on, I think you will find something from this album. It's a jazz album in commas, but it really is indebted to funk, you know, and its intention from the start was to fundamentally be a funk album. And I think it's a nice sort of olive branch, if you will. It's a nice bridge between sort of more pure, although this is pure, I'm not gatekeeping, but more traditional, let's say, jazz, and funk and stuff. Some fusion stuff I'm not personally that keen on. I do find it occasionally a bit trite, but this album is so good. I'd recommend it to anyone that's into kind of soul, funk, jazz. Yeah, it's brilliant. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I've definitely rambled on for way too long, but I really love this album. Give it a like and subscribe. Love to know your opinions below. And yeah, see you next week. Bye.